Okay, so finally the Z8 is here. I'll do a quick unboxing video and then we'll talk about some of the reason as to why I chose to buy the Z8 and why should you consider buying it, or maybe you should wait a little bit. I won't be going over the features of this camera because I think there have been too many videos already on YouTube covering almost all aspects of the camera, including the settings, some of the settings that you should start off with, like autofocus, setting a date. Okay, before I go ahead with the unboxing, a couple of things. I bought this camera from a seller in India, and over here there are a few free items that are included along with the camera, namely a 128 GB CF Express Type B memory card from ProGrade and an ENEL15C battery, an additional battery. So the camera comes with one battery and there's an additional battery which is provided for free. Not sure if in the other regions that is provided. I did one thing though, which I will get into detail in a little bit. I swapped the free card that was provided with the camera, which was a ProGrade Gold 128 GB CF Express Type B card, for a ProGrade Cobalt 165 GB CF Express Type B card. So before we move on further, let's do a quick unboxing and then we can get into the details about why I finally decided to upgrade to a Z8, or why I had not chosen the Z9 before this, or why I had not chosen anything after buying my D500 and D750. So shall we? So there you are, the Z8 body along with the ProGrade CF Express Type B 165 GB memory card. All right, so that's the camera. This is the ProGrade CF Express 2.0 Type B 165 GB memory card. And I'll tell you why I chose this. So basically, the card that came free with the body, or which Nikon India is providing free with the body, is the ProGrade Gold 128 GB card, which has a maximum speed of 1700 Mbps if I'm not mistaken. Now, the maximum speed does not mean anything. It's the minimum sustained speed that you should focus on. Now that particular card has a minimum sustained speed of 140 Mbps, which is not sufficient for high resolution video, or if you're taking a lot of shots in bursts, it'll take some time to clear out the buffer. So it's always advisable to use a card which has a higher minimum sustained speed. So this one has a minimum sustained, this particular card, ProGrade Cobalt, this has a minimum sustained speed of 1400 Mbps, which is plenty, which is good for 8K video as well as 4K 120 frames. And even if you're shooting like 20 frames per second stills at full resolution and uncompressed RAW, this will actually clear out the buffer much faster. So that's out of the way. Next is, let's see the box. So as you can see, the box says, includes an additional Nikon ENEL15C battery worth something. This is in Indian currency, so I'm not sure if it's going to make much sense to you. So let's open the box. So as usual, we have the Nikon service warranty. I think so. This comes with a 1-year warranty. I thought Nikon products used to come with 2 years warranty in India. Seems like they've reduced the time for that. Okay, this is the user manual. Some more paperwork. Oh no, they do indeed have 2 years comprehensive warranty. So that's the warranty card. All right, drum rolls. So now comes the main compartment. This is one EN-EL15C battery. This is the charging brick. The USB-C type A to type C cable, USB type A to type C cable, shoulder strap, the second EN-EL15C battery, this is the charging cable. What do we have here? I gotta figure out what this is. I do remember this, but for the life of me, I can't seem to remember right now what exactly this is. But we'll get to that. And now the body. Let's keep these aside for now. It's quite hefty, quite heavy. Wow, man, this really feels good in the hand. Everything is where they're supposed to be. The buttons and layout is quite familiar to a Nikon user. So that's that. That's the unboxing part. So I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade and a half. And I started off with using a Nikon and I've been with them ever since. I did consider in between moving to Canon or Sony for some time, but didn't quite make that switch, but because I'm quite heavily invested in the Nikon ecosystem. So right now, right, so if you were to look at the mirrorless space, you have the three giants, the three big brands like Canon, Nikon and Sony. They all have amazing cameras, amazing pro cameras, prosumer bodies, as well as entry-level bodies. The reason why I thought I should wait a little bit for a good camera from the house of Nikon as opposed to moving to Canon, because Nikon has been like quite late in the game when it came to providing competitive sort of features to their cameras when they were compared head to head with Sony and Canon. They almost always fell short in some key areas like autofocus. So it was some time, and that traditional Nikon users or people who have been with the brand for quite some time, for several decades, they were about to sort of give up on the brand. And many of them kind of moved on to other brands because there was a feeling that the brand was not listening to what they want. The reason I hung around and waited for Nikon was because for two reasons. Firstly, being a wildlife photographer, right, you end up taking a lot of pictures on the field, and then you sort through them and then you keep the best. And when you are taking a lot of pictures on every outing, it becomes absolutely imperative that your starting point, which is your raw file, right, with the basic setting, the picture quality, the color science, everything is to a certain extent at a particular level of quality. Otherwise, what happens is you end up spending a lot of time in in tweaking the color scheme, the white balance, not the white balance, but the basic sort of color scheme of a particular raw file to get it to your sort of desired level. So that increases your post-processing time by quite a lot. And sometimes when you are working with a lot of pictures, it becomes very difficult to sort of invest sufficient time for your post-processing, as well as be ready for the following day and then go out on the field and then take more pictures. And then the cycle continues after that. The reason I stuck with Nikon was because the file that comes right off the camera kind of is 80% of the work. After that, the remaining 20% can be tweaked in post-processing. You don't need to put in a lot of effort into making those files final, if I can call them that. We are in 2023 now. So at this point, one might ask, why Nikon? Why not Canon or Sony? Considering the other brands are moving way faster than Nikon. So basically the reason was, see, if you go after specs, you would be misled to a large extent. Now why I'm saying this is because many of the other brands, without taking any names or anything, they would advertise for certain features which are available but at a very perfect condition or in a perfect environment. It's like, to give you an analogy, it's like the claim mileage of a vehicle when you buy it, right? So you see a new vehicle in the market and then you're curious as to how much mileage does the car provides, and the manufacturer says that it's like, I don't know, 20 kilometers to the liter or 50 mpg, miles per gallon. And then when you're actually driving the car in real world, you find that the car only returns about 12 kilometers to the liter, or about 30 mpg or something like that. So the real world numbers are quite different from the feature set that is actually advertised. To give you an example, without taking a brand name, a certain camera which had a lot of hype about it when it first broke into the scene, and there was a huge waiting period for that, and people were going absolutely gaga about it, and that still remains a pretty popular and an excellent workhorse for people who are into that brand and that brand ecosystem. Now, it was initially advertised that the maximum burst rate for that camera was around 20 frames per second in electronic shutter mode. Now, nowhere, or not that I'm aware of, was it mentioned that the burst rate would reduce by a certain level once the battery charge is at 50%. So in such situations, what do you do, right? When you, for a wildlife photographer like me, if you are out on the field, right, you do carry additional batteries. But when you know that the batteries are only usable up to 50%, what do you do after that? Right? So in effect, if you're carrying 4 batteries with you, you basically have just 2, because you can only use them till 50% to make the most of them. So those things, I'm not saying Nikon does not do that at all, but I find them to be more transparent on those things to a large extent. Next reason is, like, I'm quite heavily invested in Nikon glass. For me to actually jump ship and go to another brand would mean a lot of additional investment, and not just the investment on the body. So that was another reason why I thought about, sort of hanging out with Nikon, at least for the time being. I'm generally a one camera guy, in the sense, like, even when I'm out on the field, right, I do carry a second body and a second lens and some additional lenses as well. But I generally carry one prime and one body, and I try to think about my compositions accordingly, right? So even if, let's just say, if I'm shooting lions in the savannah, they're usually, you start off at a distance with them, right? So you basically start off at a distance, and then you slowly, the lions come towards you, or you go towards the lions. So generally what happens is you change to, like, shorter focal lengths and different bodies if you're carrying them. Generally what I do is I start off with long shots with my prime lens when I'm at a distance, and then when I come very close to them, I shoot tight portraits, right? I'm not saying that's the right way to doing stuff, but I kind of, like, whenever I'm on the field, I kind of see everything through that one lens. I try to see everything through that one lens, right? So then again, so my prime lens is used more often than some of the other lenses, the zoom lenses that I have. One more advantage that I see with Nikon is the subject tracking when the subject is coming towards the camera. Now this I have noticed with some of the other brands. The subject tracking is probably excellent on them when the subject is moving laterally, in the sense they're moving parallel to you, right? And but when the subject is approaching you, right, that's where the focus kind of hunts or it loses it completely, right? This is where I think Nikon shines, especially with the sun at a weird angle. If the subject is coming towards you, I think the Nikon autofocus kind of nails it more often than not. Next is silent shooting. I think a lot of the prosumer, I mean, if I can call the Z8 a prosumer body, because generally you have the pro body, which is like your flagship bodies like the Z9, A1s and R3s of the world, and then the next in line are supposed to be called the prosumer bodies like the R5, A7RV and the Z8. I think silent shooting is something which is a blessing in all mirrorless cameras. Now apart from that, what is important is the frame rates that you get, right? A camera body might offer 20 frames per second or 10 frames per second, 20 frames per second, 30, 40 frames per second, and there is no end to the madness. Now the question is, when you're getting higher frame rates, how much of those photographs that you take at higher frame rates are actually usable? Let me explain that a little bit. Now, when would you use high burst rates? To capture action, to capture motion, and to basically capture something which is happening in a very erratic or frequent manner, right? When you're capturing motion, right, or when you're capturing erratic motion or like high-speed action, sports, wildlife, birds in flight, what happens is if you're using high speed burst, you need to shoot them in by using the mechanical shutter in most cameras, because the sensor readout speed affects the output, the final output that you get. Let me explain that a little bit. In programming language, we have a concept of compiler and interpreter. So a compiler basically reads the whole code, like if there are 500 lines of code or 600 lines of code or 1000 lines of code, it'll read the whole code and compile it in one go. And then you have something called an interpreter, which would read the code line by line, right? And then execute it. So image sensor kind of works like an interpreter, in the sense like the data is filled and then it is cleared out line by line, right? So what happens is when you have a sensor which has an extremely slow readout speed, and when I say slow, I mean it's still pretty fast, but comparatively slow to a mechanical shutter, what it does is from the time it starts reading from the top to the point where it reaches the bottom, by that time, the time it takes to actually do that path, the subject would have made some minute movement. Because of that movement, what happens is the final output that you get is slightly warped. Like let's just say if you're shooting a bird in flight, the wing might be warped at a weird angle. Or if you're shooting sports like say tennis or golf, you would see that the club or the tennis racket is slightly bent or warped, right? So those kind of look unnatural. Now what Nikon has done is they have provided a stack sensor, the exact same sensor that they have on Z9, right? And as of now, only flagships were known to have stack sensors because they are more expensive to produce. Most prosumer bodies or cheaper bodies were not known to have them. Nikon kind of changed that, and they provided a stack sensor on their prosumer body. Now this has a readout speed which is comparable to a mechanical shutter, which is why you don't see a mechanical shutter at all in the Z9 body or the Z8 for that matter. Now what that provides to the user is the usable burst rate. What do I mean by usable burst rate? In the sense like if that camera body provides you a high burst rate of 20 per second, you will get 20 per second, 20 frames per second. You know, it does not depend on how much charge your battery has, or it's not going to result in warped images. Next thing I want to talk about is whether the Z8 is a worthy successor of the D500 and the D850. There's been a lot of talk about that on the internet, and I'll tell you that it's, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it is a successor. I would say that it's a memorable milestone for Nikon. And why I'm saying that? So I do believe that the D500 and the D850 twin, when they were released back in 2015, 2016, they were the clear-cut sort of, you know, top dog in the market at that point of time. They were the best sort of DSLRs that money could buy at that point of time, irrespective of brands, technology, what have you. The Z8, I would say, is also a sort of a huge milestone for Nikon in that regard. It does have a lot of features that might give the competition sleepless nights. But is it a successor? I mean, how do you define a successor? Right? What are the attributes that one is considering when one calls the Z8 a successor? Or one needs to consider to call a particular camera a successor to another one. It does not have the same model name. If it was called a Z850, maybe you could have said that Z8 is indeed a successor, or Z850 is indeed a successor, because it's basically the next model in the same product line. But it's not. So that's that for that particular sort of discourse, if I may. Lastly, I want to touch a bit about the autofocus of the camera, right? I see a lot of talk on the internet about how Nikon's autofocus is not one of their strong suits, and how the competition provide better autofocus even on their entry-level cameras, which Nikon might not match up to or may not match up to. So to sort of dissect this whole autofocus discourse, let me give you a simple example from another industry. So let's talk automobiles, and that's another industry which I'm a little familiar about. So you have different kinds of transmissions in vehicles, right? You have manual transmissions or stick shifts, you have automatic torque converters, you have CVT, constant variable transmissions, and then you have a few sort of hybrid transmissions like AMTs, which are automated manual transmission, or IMT, which are intelligent manual transmissions, so on and so forth, right? So if I were to compare, and all these different sorts of transmissions have advantages and disadvantages, right? Some are less reliable, some are more reliable, and depending on your use case, you might choose one over the other, right? A manual would give you better gas mileage. Torque converter automatic might give you more convenience, like in stop and go traffic and city traffic, so on and so forth. When it comes to cameras, or Nikon in particular, right, their autofocus can be compared to an IMT, an intelligent manual transmission. Now bear with me, I'll just explain that a little bit. If you compare the autofocus system of some of the competition, right, you would see that the camera actually does a lot for you, right? So all you have to do is just select a wide area focus, and the camera will pick up the subject, lock on its eyes, and that's it. In Nikon, however, what you need to do is you need to be in the proper AF mode, and there is a concept of handoff that you need to do. Now, what do I mean when I say that? So basically, let's just say if you're in wide area, wide, right, and you sort of frame your subject where it falls under that small rectangle that you have in your viewfinder, and then when it locks the subject on the eye, right, you basically do a handoff autofocus and you switch to 3D tracking, and then the focus would be extremely sticky and you'll nail focus almost all the time, right? So there is this additional step that is required. Now in IMT, back to automobiles, what happens is you do have a gear lever, but you don't have clutch. So you don't have to think about pressing the clutch and then changing your gears. The clutching happens automatically. It's just that the gears that you need to change. In a torque converter, there's no clutch, there's no gear lever. So what you need to do is just press gas, that's all, right? However, in most torque converters, you would see, like, at times when you have to quickly overtake a vehicle or quickly pass a vehicle, when you floor your gas pedal, what happens is the rev goes up, but the vehicle might not move that quickly, right? It takes a bit of time to build and then it moves. But on an IMT, all you have to do is just drop a gear with the gear lever, and the car would be responsive immediately and you can get a move on. Similarly, when you let the camera decide on a wide area, like at which sort of point to focus, given their algorithms, they might be able to do it very briskly. But at times, if it fails at doing that, right, you might have a difficult time to sort of navigate and then bring back the focus to the desired subject. With Nikon system, what I find is, like, since you already have that reference box, right, your wide area, the subject almost always, like, generally when you're shooting, you're looking at the subject through the viewfinder, you basically have to point the wide area to the subject and automatically it will get a lock, right? So like I mentioned, there are advantages and disadvantages. You cannot say that one is better than the other. It completely depends on your workflow. If you need the camera to do, find the subject for you, lock on its eyes and get you the image, I would say you're better off going ahead with an A7RV or even a Canon R5 for that matter, right? So those are some of the discussions, I believe, around the autofocus. Again, it's not a black and white kind of discussion, I would say. There's a lot of gray area there. Finally, the main question: should you upgrade to the Z8? My thing is, see, I'm mostly a one camera guy, right? So I basically use a D500 with a 500 f4 500 mm f4 lens. That's been my that's been my main workhorse for the most parts. Most of my award-winning pictures have been shot through that particular combination. Now, did I feel the need to sort of upgrade? I would say for 90% of my work, no, I did not. But there is that 10% for which I kind of thought about upgrading. The reason I didn't go for the Z9 was because it was too bulky, and because of my photography expedition where I shoot snow leopards and I have to go to remote areas, right? There's a lot of hiking involved. There's a lot of trek involved. And when you're carrying heavy camera and heavy gear, right, it adds on to the weight. And already when you're going to like really high altitudes, there's less oxygen there. And, you are mostly struggling with the elements. Saving 1 kilo or a couple of pounds here and there actually matters, right? So carrying a very heavy, huge camera, right, on your backpack didn't seem like a good idea to me at that point, right? But this, yeah, I think I can live with this, right? The form factor and the weight. So should you upgrade? I would say if you are a Nikon shooter and if you have not upgraded to the Nikon mirrorless, I would say if you are not considering upgrading, rent out one, right? Just rent one, just go through the menu system, use some of the features and see if it is going to help you in your workflow and if it's going to help you getting better pictures. If you are into some other brands or other ecosystem and you're considering switching to Nikon, again, the same advice applies. Rent one first. See if it feels good in your hands and if the menu system is intuitive, you don't find it difficult to navigate through it, and you're able to get what you envision, right? If you're able to get the same kind of output. And that's all the points that I had that I wanted to discuss. And as always, take care of yourself, and I'll see you later in the next video. Bye now.